The lurch of the iron carriage was a violent, physical punctuation to the tremor in her soul. Alara Bishop pressed her forehead against the grimy glass, the vibration rattling her teeth. Outside, the world was an endless, sun-bleached canvas of brown and pale green, a terrifying emptiness that mirrored the hollowness within her. For 3 days, this had been her world. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track, the smell of coal smoke and unwashed bodies, and the relentless, suffocating presence of the lie she carried west. In her lap, her gloved fingers nervously traced the edges of a worn piece of paper, the ink faded from countless readings. A letter from a man she'd never met, in a place she couldn't imagine. A Mr. Jedediah Stone of Redemption Creek, Montana Territory. His words were simple, direct. He wrote of his ranch, of the need for a partner to brave the loneliness of the plains, of building a life from the unforgiving soil. Her own letter in reply had been a masterpiece of omission. She wrote of her temperament, her skills in housekeeping, her quiet nature. She had presented herself as a suitable, if perhaps plain, candidate for a wife. She had neglected to mention the most crucial detail, the one that had unwritten her entire future. The memory came unbidden, sharp as a shard of glass. The Philadelphia doctor's office, smelling of carbolic acid and stale air. The doctor, a man with pince-nez spectacles and a pitying gaze, delivering the verdict with clinical detachment. A congenital defect of the womb, Mrs. Bishop. I am afraid you will be unable to bear children. It is God's will. God's will. It had felt more like a curse. Her fiancé, a respectable shipping clerk with aspirations, had called it a breach of contract. His family had called her a fraud. The life she had planned, the only life a woman of her station was supposed to want, had dissolved into whispers and averted gazes. Shame was a heat that had followed her everywhere, a constant flush on her cheeks. And so she had run. She had answered the advertisement in the back of a gazette, a desperate plea from a world away. Mail order bride wanted. Sober man of good character seeks a wife to share a home. Honesty and a strong constitution are all that is required. Honesty. The word mocked her from the page. Her entire journey was predicated on a lie. She was a damaged vessel, selling herself as whole. Each mile the train carried her west was a mile deeper into her deception. She imagined Mr. Stone's face when she told him. Would his kind eyes, which she had pictured from the tone of his letter, turn to stone themselves? Would he cast her out into this savage wilderness? The train's whistle tore through the air, a long, mournful shriek that vibrated in her bones. It was the sound of arrival, the sound of judgment. Alara straightened her bonnet, her hands trembling as she tucked the letter away. She was here, Redemption Creek, a place for second chances. Or perhaps a place where her last hope would finally die. Stepping from the train was like stepping into another world. The air, thin and dry, tasted of dust and pine. Redemption Creek wasn't so much a town as a raw wound in the landscape, a chaotic sprawl of unpainted lumber buildings lining a wide, muddy street that served as its main artery. The symphony of the place was overwhelming. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the rhythmic rasp of a saw from a half-finished structure, the boisterous laughter spilling from a saloon with bat-wing doors, and the ever-present whinnying of horses. Men in dusty hats and worn denim stopped and stared, their gazes lingering on her with an undisguised curiosity that made her skin crawl. She was a new specimen, a splash of gray wool civility in a world of buckskin and dirt. She scanned the platform, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. And then she saw him. He was taller than she'd imagined, his shoulders a formidable width beneath a simple chambray shirt. His face was tanned a deep brown by the sun, etched with fine lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into the horizon. He wasn't handsome in the polished way of the men back east, but his face held a quiet solidity, a sense of patient strength. In his large, work-roughened hand, he held a small, slightly clumsy bouquet of purple and yellow wildflowers. He must have seen the recognition in her eyes, because a slow, hesitant smile touched his lips. He moved toward her, his steps deliberate. "Mrs. Bishop?" he asked, his voice a low baritone, softer than she'd expected. Mr. Stone, she managed, her own voice barely a whisper. Jedediah, or just Jed. He extended the flowers. Welcome to Redemption Creek. I figured the land could offer a better greeting than I could. Alara took the small bouquet, her fingers brushing his. His skin was calloused but warm. The simple, unpretentious gesture was so unexpected, so disarmingly kind that tears pricked the backs of her eyes. They're beautiful, she said, meaning it more than she could say. The ride to the ranch is a fair ways, he said, effortlessly lifting her heavy trunk as if it weighed nothing. Best we get started before sundown. As Jed led her toward a sturdy buckboard wagon, Alara's gaze swept the town again. Her eyes snagged on a woman standing on the boardwalk in front of a building marked Banker. The woman was dressed in severe black silk, her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face. She watched Alara's progress with an unnerving intensity, and when their eyes met, the woman offered a smile that was all teeth and no warmth, a calculated assessment that sent a chill down Alara's spine. The feeling was sickeningly familiar. It was the look of a judge. Jed helped her onto the wagon seat, seemingly oblivious to the scrutiny. As they pulled away, the mud of the main street sucking at the wheels, Alara clutched the wildflowers to her chest like a shield. She was here, she had met the man, he was kind. But the cold smile of the woman in black was a stark reminder that the wilderness wasn't just in the landscape. It was in the hearts of people, too. The journey to the Stone Ranch was one of expanding silence and scale. The clamor of Redemption Creek faded behind them, replaced by the creak of the wagon wheels and the whisper of the wind through tall grasses. Jedediah pointed out landmarks. A lone butte shaped like a sleeping giant, a creek bed lined with cottonwoods, the distant hazy blue of a mountain range he called the Bear's Teeth. He spoke with a quiet reverence for the land, a deep-seated affection that was contagious. Alara found herself unclenching her jaw, the rigid posture of her fear softening with every mile. The ranch itself was nestled in a shallow valley, protected from the harshest winds. It was a testament to hard work and perseverance. The log cabin was small but sturdy, with a stone chimney breathing a thin curl of smoke. A well-built barn stood nearby, along with a series of corrals. It was an island of order in a vast, untamed sea. It was beautiful in its stark simplicity. Inside, the cabin was clean and Spartan. A heavy wooden table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, and a bed in the corner covered with a thick quilt. A young, wiry man with dark eyes and a shy smile was tending a stew on the stove. Alara, this is Mateo, Jed said. He helps me work this place. Couldn't do it without him. Mateo nodded respectfully. Ma'am, he said, his voice soft. He quickly and quietly served them bowls of the savory beef stew before retreating to his own small bunkhouse near the barn, affording them privacy. The meal was eaten in a thick, charged silence. The stew was delicious, warming her from the inside out, but every bite felt like a prelude to the bitter words she knew she had to speak. The lie sat between them on the table, heavier than the iron stove. When the bowls were empty, Alara knew she could not delay any longer. She folded her hands in her lap, her knuckles white. Mr. Stone? Jedediah? He looked at her, his kind eyes patient. Jed? He corrected gently. Jed, she repeated, the name feeling foreign on her tongue. There is something I must tell you, something I should have written in my letter. It was a failing on my part, a deception, and you have every right to be angry. She took a shaky breath, and the words tumbled out, a torrent of shame she had held back for so long. She told him of the doctor, of the diagnosis, of her broken engagement. She didn't spare herself, detailing the humiliation and her family's pity. She ended, her voice cracking, her gaze fixed on the wooden grain of the table. I cannot have children, she whispered into the sudden, profound silence of the cabin. I am barren. I understand that a man takes a wife to build a family, to have sons to carry on his name. I have deceived you, and I will work to repay you for the train ticket. You can send me back on the next one. She finally dared to look up, bracing for the kindness in his eyes to curdle into contempt, the patience to harden into anger. Jed was silent for a long time, his gaze distant, looking at a memory she couldn't see. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound in the world, When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion she couldn't place. "I had a wife," he began softly. "Mary. We had a son, little Samuel. He had her eyes." He paused, swallowing hard. "This land gives, Alara, but it takes, too. Cholera came through 3 summers ago. Took them both inside of a week. I buried them myself, up on that ridge." He gestured vaguely toward the window. "I learned a long time ago that life doesn't give you guarantees. It gives you moments. And it can take them away just as fast." He leaned forward, and to her astonishment, he reached across the table and covered her trembling hands with his own large, warm one. His touch was grounding, a steady anchor in her sea of shame. "I'm not looking for a legacy, Alara. I buried my legacy on that hill. I'm just looking for someone to share the sunsets with." He met her tear-filled gaze, his own eyes clear and certain. "Love is enough. You being here, that's enough." In that moment, under the gentle lamplight of a stranger's cabin 1,000 miles from everything she had ever known, the crushing weight Alara had carried for years finally began to lift. A single tear escaped and traced a path through the travel dust on her cheek. It was a tear not of sorrow, but of a fragile, terrifying, and overwhelming hope. A traveling preacher, a gaunt man with a weather-beaten Bible and a horse that looked as tired as he did, married them a few days later. The ceremony took place on the porch of the cabin, with the vast sky as their cathedral and a quietly observant Mateo as their sole witness. The words were simple, the promises profound. When Jed slipped a plain, hammered iron ring onto her finger, a ring he'd fashioned himself at his forge, it felt more real and binding than any diamond she might have worn in her old life. The days that followed were a gentle immersion into a new existence. Alara discovered a rhythm she never knew she craved. She rose with the sun, the air crisp and clean. She learned the comforting weight of kneading dough, the satisfaction of seeing neat rows of stitches mend Jed's worn shirts, the small miracle of seeds sprouting in the garden she planted near the cabin. She and Jed worked in a comfortable orbit around each other, their conversations growing from hesitant questions to shared stories. A genuine affection was taking root in the soil of their arrangement, as tender and tenacious as the seedlings in her garden. She learned the language of his silences, and he in turn seemed to understand the fears she still held but no longer spoke aloud. A week after their wedding, their supplies ran low, necessitating a trip to Redemption Creek. As they rode in the buckboard, Alara felt a flutter of anxiety. This would be their first appearance in town as a married couple. It felt like a test. The test began in the dust-moated interior of the general store. As Jed negotiated with the proprietor over the price of flour and coffee, a man detached himself from the shadows. He was in his 50s, impeccably dressed for a place like Redemption Creek in a tailored frock coat and polished boots. He moved with the predatory grace of a wolf, and his smile was wide and welcoming, but it never touched his cold, assessing eyes. "Stone," the man said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "I heard the news. Congratulations. A man shouldn't be alone in this country." He turned his smile on Alara, and it felt like a physical touch, unwelcome and invasive. "Silas Vance," he introduced himself. "My humble ranch borders your modest spread." "Vance," Jed acknowledged, his tone polite but cool. "Now that you have a wife to think of, a family to provide for," Vance continued, his gaze sweeping over Alara as if she were livestock, "perhaps you'll reconsider my generous offer. That dry patch of rock you call home, it's hardly fit to support a family. I'll take it off your hands. Give you enough to start fresh somewhere more hospitable." Alara saw the muscles in Jed's jaw tighten. "The land's not for sale, Vance," Jed said, his voice level but carrying a new hardness. "My wife and I are quite content." Vance's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. "A shame," he said, clapping Jed on the shoulder. "Every man has his breaking point, Stone. I'll find yours." The words were a silken threat. He tipped his hat to Alara and sauntered away, leaving a chill in his wake. Shaken, they finished their purchases and stepped back out into the harsh sunlight. Their path was immediately blocked by the woman Alara had seen on her first day, the banker's wife. Mrs. Stone, she exclaimed, her voice high and saccharine. I am Beatrice Hemlock. As the wife of our town's foremost citizen, I consider it my duty to welcome you. She took Alara's hand in a grip that was surprisingly strong, her eyes doing a swift, critical inventory of Alara's simple dress. It's a pleasure, Alara murmured, wanting nothing more than to pull her hand away. We were all so thrilled to hear of your union, Beatrice gushed, her gaze sharp and prying. A fine, hard-working man like Mr. Stone deserves a full and fruitful life. Tell me, dear, when can we expect the pitter-patter of little feet? A strong son to help his father, I'm sure. God's greatest blessing to a marriage, is it not? The question was a physical blow, striking the most vulnerable part of her. Alara felt the blood drain from her face. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Jed stepped forward, placing a protective hand on the small of Alara's back. That's our business, Mrs. Hemlock, he said, his voice quiet but glacial. If you'll excuse us, the wife is tired. He guided a trembling Alara back to the wagon, leaving Beatrice Hemlock standing on the boardwalk, her sweet smile curdling into a look of undisguised malice. The vulture had circled, and the wasp had found her sting. The battle for their home, Alara realized with a dawning horror, would be fought on two very different and equally dangerous fronts. The venom of Beatrice Hemlock's words spread through Redemption Creek like a fever. It was a subtle poison, administered in hushed tones over sewing circles and knowing glances across the aisles of the general store. Beatrice, with her unimpeachable status as the banker's wife and her armor of pious certainty, framed Alara's story as a cautionary tale. She was the barren swindler from the East, a woman who had entrapped a good, grieving man with deceit. The narrative was simple, cruel, and devastatingly effective. Alara felt the shift immediately. On her next trip into town for thread, the knot of women gathered near the counter, including Mrs. Hemlock, fell silent the moment she pushed the door open. Their conversation died, but their eyes followed her every move, cold and condemning. When she approached the counter, the storekeeper's wife, who had been friendly just weeks before, served her without a smile, her lips a thin, disapproving line. The antagonism was maddeningly intangible. No one accused her outright. There were no shouts or public scenes. It was a war of 1,000 tiny cuts. A woman pulling her child closer as Alara walked past. A group turning their backs to her at the church social. A comment made just loud enough to be overheard. A marriage's purpose is to be fruitful and multiply, as the good book says. The old shame, which Jed's love had soothed into a dull ache, began to throb with fresh pain. The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a fortress under siege. She began to dread the trips to town, the weight of a dozen judgmental gazes making her feel small and fraudulent all over again. Jed saw it all. He saw the way she flinched when he suggested they go for supplies, the shadow that crossed her face, the way she made herself smaller, quieter. His anger was a slow, simmering fire. He was a man of action, a man who met threats head-on. He wanted to confront the gossips, to call out Beatrice Hemlock for her cruelty, to defend his wife's honor with the same ferocity he would defend his land. "Let me talk to them," he'd say, his hands clenched into fists at his side. "I won't have them treating you this way." But Alara would shake her head, her eyes pleading. "Please, Jed." "No," she would whisper. "It will only make it worse. You'll be the talk of the town, the hot-headed husband of the barren wife. It will only give them more ammunition. Please, just let it be." This became the first true point of friction between them. His protective instinct warred with her fear of escalating the conflict. He couldn't understand the uniquely female cruelty she was facing, a battlefield of whispers and social ostracism where a man's anger was a clumsy, ineffective weapon. And she couldn't make him see that her deepest fear was not their judgment of her, but that their poison would eventually taint him too. So he would fall silent, his frustration a palpable presence in the small cabin. And Alara would retreat further into herself, the joyous peace of their first weeks slowly being chipped away by the faceless, whispering jury of Redemption Creek. The whispers were a sickness, but Silas Vance's brand of war was a physical wound. The threat he'd made in the general store had not been idle. It began subtly. A length of fence cut in the dead of night, allowing a handful of cattle to wander off, costing Jed and Mateo a full day of hard riding to recover them. A week later, a sack of feed was slit open, its contents spilled into the mud. They were provocations, designed to wear them down, to test their resolve. Then, the testing ended. One morning, as the sun crested the mountains, Jed rode out to check the north pasture. He found what he had begun to fear. The fence wasn't just cut, it had been torn down. And beyond it, two of his best steers lay dead, shot and left to rot under the unforgiving sun. A cold, hard fury settled over Jed. This was no longer about intimidation, this was a declaration. He followed the tracks, his Winchester rifle resting easy across his lap. Mateo had insisted on riding with him, his young face grim, a long knife sheathed at his belt. They found them in a small canyon, watering their horses. 3 men, their faces familiar from the saloons in town. One of them was a tall, whip-thin man with a cruel mouth and a livid scar that cut through his left eyebrow. Lash, one of Vance's top dogs. There were no words exchanged. Lash saw them, and his hand went to the pistol on his hip. The canyon exploded in a cacophony of gunfire. It wasn't the clean, choreographed violence of dime novels. It was messy, desperate, and terrifyingly fast. Jed threw himself from his horse, rolling behind a cluster of boulders as bullets whizzed past his head, smacking into the rock with sharp cracks. Mateo provided covering fire from a stand of juniper trees, his rifle barking in quick succession. Jed was a different man in that moment. The patient, gentle husband was gone, replaced by a deadly pragmatist forged by the harsh realities of survival. He fired with calm efficiency, not wasting shots. He saw one of Vance's men cry out and clutch his shoulder, stumbling back behind his horse. Lash was a more formidable opponent. He moved with a snake-like speed, firing from multiple positions, his bullets kicking up dust perilously close to Jed's cover. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder, and the ringing in their ears was deafening. The fight ended as abruptly as it began. Seeing one of their own wounded and realizing Jed and Mateo were not the easy targets they'd expected, Lash let out a string of curses and motioned for his men to retreat. They mounted their horses and galloped away, leaving the scent of their malice behind. Jed didn't pursue. He stood slowly, reloading his Winchester, his knuckles white. The adrenaline receded, leaving a grim certainty in its place. He looked at the bodies of his cattle, a senseless waste. Then he looked at Mateo, who was checking Jed's horse, a fine bay gelding, and saw the dark patch of blood spreading on its flank. A bullet meant for him had struck his mount. The horse would have to be put down. He rode back to the cabin on Mateo's horse, leading his own wounded animal. Alara met him on the porch, her face pale with dread. She had heard the distant shots and had been imagining the worst for hours. When she saw the blood on his horse and the cold, hard set of his jaw, she knew that the whispering war had ended. A louder, deadlier war had just begun. The isolation Alara felt was now tinged with a sharp, metallic taste of fear. The whispers in town were one thing. The echo of gunshots was another entirely. She felt trapped, a prisoner in her own home, which no longer felt like a sanctuary but a target. It was during a tense trip to town for medical supplies for the wounded horse that a small crack of light broke through her despair. She was in the general store enduring the usual silent treatment when a quiet voice spoke her name. "Mrs. Stone?" Alara turned to see a small, plain woman with kind eyes. It was Martha Simmons, the wife of the town doctor. She was rarely seen at Beatrice Hemlock's social gatherings, preferring her husband's company and her books. "I heard about your trouble," Martha said, her voice low. "Silas Vance is a cancer on this town. Don't let Beatrice and her flock of hens make you think everyone here agrees with them." She pressed a small, cloth-wrapped bundle into Alara's hand. "This is a poultice for burns and scrapes. My husband swears by it. You look like you could use a friend." The simple act of kindness, the public acknowledgement in the face of the other's scorn, was so powerful it nearly brought Alara to tears. "Thank you," she managed to say. The small gesture was a lifeline, a reminder that not every heart in Redemption Creek was cold. The attack, however, had ignited something else in Alara besides fear. A slow-burning anger. She was tired of being a victim, tired of waiting behind a cabin door while her husband fought for their lives. She was tired of being afraid. That evening, as Jed cleaned his Winchester rifle by the firelight, his movements economical and grim, she watched him with a new resolve. The rifle wasn't just a weapon, it was a tool, and she was no longer content to be helpless. "Jed," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "I want you to teach me how to use that." He stopped, looking up at her. He saw the fear in her eyes, but underneath it, something new, a core of steel. He was hesitant. The thought of her being involved in the violence, of putting this instrument of death in her hands, went against every protective instinct he had. He wanted to shield her from that part of the world. "Elara, this ain't a game," he said softly. "I know," she replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Lash and his men taught me that. They think this house is a soft target because there's a woman inside. I want them to be wrong. I won't be the reason we lose this home. I won't be the weakness they can exploit." He saw the unshakable determination in her jaw, the same determination he'd seen when she confessed her secret to him on her first night. She was not a fragile doll from the East. She was a survivor. He nodded slowly. "All right, tomorrow morning." The next day, he took her out onto the prairie, away from the cabin. He showed her how to hold the heavy rifle, how to brace it against her shoulder, how to load the cartridges, how to work the lever action, how to sight down the long barrel. Her hands were clumsy at first, her movements uncertain. The first time she fired, the noise was a physical blow, and the kick of the butt against her shoulder was far stronger than she'd anticipated, knocking her back a step and sending a sharp, stinging pain through her. But she didn't drop the gun. She gritted her teeth, reset her stance, and listened as Jed calmly corrected her grip. She practiced every day. The repetitive physical act of loading, aiming, and firing became a kind of meditation. The heavy rifle grew less alien in her hands. The bruise on her shoulder faded from an angry purple to a dull yellow, a badge of her progress. The focused discipline burned away the edges of her fear, replacing it with a hard-won competence. And as Jed watched her, his patient instruction a constant, steady presence, their bond deepened. They were no longer just a husband and wife falling in love. They were partners preparing for a war, side by side. Vance's campaign of attrition escalated with a chilling ruthlessness. The time for warnings was over. One night, a flickering orange glow against the bedroom window woke them. A fire had been set in the tall, dry grass, a hungry line of flames advancing steadily toward the barn. Jed and Mateo, working with frantic, desperate energy, beat back the fire with wet sacks and shovels of dirt for over an hour. Elara, her heart pounding, shuttled buckets of water from the well, her nightgown soaked, her face smudged with soot. They saved the barn, but the smell of smoke lingered for days, a constant reminder of their vulnerability. A week later, the water from their well turned foul, reeking of decay. Jed, his face a mask of grim fury, winched up the bucket to find the bloated carcass of a coyote. They had to spend 2 days cleaning the well, boiling every drop of water for drinking, their thirst a constant companion. The attacks were relentless, designed to exhaust them, to break their spirits through sleep deprivation and ceaseless labor. The true siege began on a moonless night. Elara was woken not by a sound, but by an instinct, a primal sense of danger that made the hair on her arms stand up. She slipped out of bed and crept to the window. In the oppressive darkness, she saw them, 4 shadows detaching themselves from the deeper shadows of the tree line, moving in a low crouch toward the cabin. "Jed," she hissed, her voice tight with terror. "They're here." Jed was awake in an instant, grabbing the shotgun he kept by the bed. "Mateo!" he yelled toward the wall of the cabin nearest the bunkhouse. "Trouble!" The next moments were a blur of chaos and noise. A bullet shattered the window Elara had just been standing at, spraying glass across the floor. Jed returned fire with a deafening blast from the shotgun, the spread of buckshot causing the shadows outside to scatter. From the bunkhouse, Mateo's rifle began to crack, a steady, disciplined rhythm. Jed pushed a rifle into Elara's hands. "Stay away from the windows. Don't fire unless you have a clear shot. Don't waste ammunition." Elara huddled against the stone hearth, her body trembling uncontrollably. The cabin felt like a fragile wooden box under assault. Bullets thudded into the log walls, splintering wood. The sound was intimate, terrifying. Outside, men shouted curses. She could hear Mateo cry out in pain, a sharp, sudden sound that lanced through her fear. A man made a run for the porch, hoping to get close enough to breach the door. In the faint starlight, Alara saw his silhouette against the night sky. Her training took over. She raised the rifle, the stock pressing into the familiar place on her shoulder. She took a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil slammed into her, but she held her ground. She didn't know if she'd hit him. She thought she saw him stumble, but her shot drew his attention. A bullet ripped through the wall just above her head. The immediate personal threat was so shocking, it momentarily paralyzed her. But her shot had provided a crucial distraction. It gave Jed the second he needed to lean out the shattered window and fire his shotgun again. A man screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, and the attack broke. They could hear the remaining men dragging their wounded comrade away, their retreat hasty and disorganized. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the ringing in Alara's ears and the sound of her own ragged breathing. Mateo stumbled in, clutching an arm that was bleeding freely. Jed had a long, shallow gash on his cheek from flying glass. The cabin was a wreck. But they were alive. They had held their ground. Alara looked down at the heavy Winchester in her hands. It was no longer a stranger's tool. She had defended her home. And in the middle of the terror, a strange, fierce pride took root. The next morning, the evidence of the attack was stark in the cold light of day. The cabin walls were pocked with bullet holes, the ground littered with spent cartridges. Jed, his arm in a makeshift sling where a bullet had grazed him, rode into town with a cold fire in his eyes. He stormed into the sheriff's office, Alara and the wounded Mateo waiting with the wagon outside. Sheriff Brody listened to Jed's furious account, his weary face impassive. He stroked his gray mustache, his eyes avoiding Jed's. When Jed finished, the sheriff heaved a deep sigh. "I went and saw your man Vance this morning, Jed," Brody said, his voice tired. "He claims some of your cattle wandered onto his land again. Says he sent his men to talk to you and your hot-headed Mexican ranch hand opened fire on them unprovoked. He's got 2 men willing to swear to it." "They're lying," Jed roared, slamming his good hand on the sheriff's desk. "Probably," Brody conceded with a shrug, "but it's their word against yours. Silas Vance owns the judge, and he's got half the town on his payroll one way or another. Unless you can produce a body or a signed confession, this is a property dispute. My advice? Keep your head down. Don't give him the excuse he's looking for." Jed left the office, his face a thundercloud of helpless rage. The law in Redemption Creek was a tool for the powerful, not a shield for the just. The news of the gunfight, twisted by Vance's narrative, spread through town. Beatrice Hemlock seized upon it with righteous glee. She saw it as divine confirmation of her judgment. Alara wasn't just a barren swindler. She was a curse, a Jonah who had brought violence and bloodshed down upon a good man. The final confrontation happened in the general store. Alara had insisted on coming, refusing to be hidden away like a shameful secret. As she was gathering her things, Beatrice entered, her entourage of sycophantic women trailing behind her. She stopped in the middle of the store, her voice ringing out for all to hear. "It is a tragedy," she declared, looking at Alara with performative pity, "a clear sign of God's displeasure. When a marriage is unnatural and fruitless, it invites chaos. This violence is a punishment, a curse brought upon this community by those who defy his will." Something inside Alara snapped. The fear, the shame, the anger, it all coalesced into a single point of cold, clear strength. She set her basket down on the counter and turned to face Beatrice. The store went silent. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the silence with absolute clarity. "You speak of God, Mrs. Hemlock, but you seem to know so little of His grace." She took a step forward. "You see my marriage as fruitless? I see a partnership built on kindness and respect. You see my husband's hardships as a curse? I see a good man defending his home from thieves. My worth, Mrs. Hemlock, is not measured by my womb. It is measured by my heart and my courage and my loyalty to my husband." She stopped directly in front of the stunned Beatrice. "And I pity you," Alara said, her voice dropping to an intense whisper. I pity you for having a heart so small and a spirit so bitter that you must tear others down to feel tall. That is a curse far greater than any you could imagine for me." She held Beatrice's gaze for a long moment, then turned, picked up her basket, and walked out of the store with her head held high. The townspeople stared, shocked into silence. Alara hadn't shouted. She hadn't cried. She had simply spoken the truth. She had not won them over, not yet, but she had claimed her own dignity in a way that was impossible to ignore. And for the first time, some of them began to wonder if the real poison in Redemption Creek wasn't the woman from the east, but the self-righteous queen bee in their midst. The question had been nagging at Jed for weeks, a persistent itch in the back of his mind. Why? Why was Silas Vance, a man who already owned the richest pastures in the valley, so pathologically obsessed with his small, rocky piece of land? The offers had been too high, the aggression too severe for a simple property dispute. There had to be something more. His mind went back to the small, intermittent stream that trickled down from the hills at the far end of his property. During the dry season, it was little more than a damp patch of earth, but it was always there, even when other creeks ran dry. On a hunch, he and Mateo decided to follow it to its source. They left before dawn, climbing into the rugged, boulder-strewn hills that formed the back wall of the valley. The terrain was difficult, forcing them to leave their horses and continue on foot. The higher they climbed, the stronger the trickle of water became, cutting a deeper channel into the rock. It led them to a place no one ever went, a narrow canyon choked with overgrown brush. Pushing their way through a thicket of willows, they found it. It wasn't a cave, exactly, but a deep grotto, its entrance shrouded in moss and ferns. And from the back of this hidden grotto, a steady, powerful stream of crystal-clear water gushed out of the rock face. It was an artesian spring, a geological miracle. It flowed with a quiet, whispering sound that gave the place a hallowed feel. Jed knelt and cupped his hands in the stream. The water was cold and sweet. He looked at Mateo, whose eyes were wide with understanding. "The Whispering Springs," Mateo breathed, giving it a name. In a territory defined by the brutal realities of drought, this spring was more valuable than a vein of gold. It was a source of life, constant and reliable. It never ran dry. With control of this water source, a man wouldn't just own a ranch, he would own the entire valley. He could dictate who got water and who didn't. He could starve out his competitors, forcing them to sell their desiccated lands for pennies on the dollar. Silas Vance didn't just want Jed's land. He wanted a kingdom, and this spring was his crown. The discovery was terrifying. It recontextualized everything. The relentless attacks, the astronomical offers, Vance's willingness to kill. It all made a terrible, greedy sense. They were not just fighting for their home. They were squatting on the key to absolute power in the region. They stood there for a long time in the cool, damp air of the grotto, the sound of the whispering water filling the silence. The knowledge was a heavy burden. It solidified their resolve, burning away any last thought of retreat. They couldn't run. To surrender the ranch now would be to surrender the entire valley to a tyrant. The stakes had been raised to a level they had never imagined. Their personal war had just become a fight for the future of Redemption Creek itself. Silas Vance was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. His strategy of attrition, the whispers, the raids, the slow siege, had failed. Jedediah Stone's resilience, and now his wife's unexpected fortitude, had become an intolerable irritation. Vance decided it was time to crush them, swiftly and decisively. He laid his trap with brutal simplicity. Knowing Jed and Mateo would be riding the southern fence line, he sent a dozen of his men, a small army, to intercept them. The fight was not a fight, it was an overwhelming assault. Jed and Mateo were dragged from their horses before they could even draw their weapons. Jed fought with the savagery of a cornered bear, but he was hopelessly outnumbered. They beat him with pistol butts and fists, a calculated, punishing assault designed not to kill, but to incapacitate and humiliate. They left him in the dust, semi-conscious and bleeding, his body a canvas of bruises and broken ribs. Mateo, younger and less of a threat, was bound, gagged, and thrown over the back of a horse. Alara was tending her garden when she saw the lone rider approach. It was Lash. He trotted his horse right up to the cabin, a cruel, triumphant sneer on his face. Behind his horse, a rope was tied to the saddle horn. At the other end of the rope, bound and bloodied, was Mateo. Lash didn't dismount. He looked down at Alara from his saddle, his eyes filled with contempt and a chilling promise of violence. "The boss is tired of the games, Mrs. Stone," he spat. "Here's the deal. Your husband is to be in town by noon tomorrow. He'll sign the deed to this rock pile over to Mr. Vance. In return, the Meskin here gets to live." He gave the rope a vicious tug, and Mateo stumbled, falling to his knees. "If he ain't there," Lash continued, his gaze lingering on Alara in a way that made her feel physically ill, "we're gonna hang your boy here from the arch in the town square. And after we're done with him, we'll be back for you." Mr. Vance said, "I could have first go. I'm looking forward to teaching you some manners." He smiled, a hideous, gap-toothed expression of pure malice. He turned his horse and rode off, dragging Mateo behind him, leaving his ultimatum hanging in the air like the stench of death. A few minutes later, Jed stumbled out of the trees, leaning heavily on his rifle, his face a swollen mask of blood and dirt. Alara ran to him, her heart seizing with terror. The final, terrible phase of their war had arrived. Jed collapsed into a chair by the table, the pain from his battered body radiating in waves. But it was the pain in his eyes that hurt Alara the most. It was the agony of defeat. "I have to do it," he rasped, his voice hoarse. "I have to sign. I can't let him kill Mateo." The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a heavy, soul-crushing despair. He was a good man, and Vance had used that goodness against him, targeting the one thing he couldn't sacrifice, the life of a loyal friend. Alara knelt before him, cleaning the blood from a cut on his forehead with a damp cloth. The woman who had arrived in Redemption Creek months ago, a creature of fear and shame, would have agreed. She would have urged him to surrender, to flee. But that woman was gone, burned away in the fires of the siege and forged anew by the love of this broken man before her. "No," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with an authority that made him look up. "We don't." She took his bruised hand in hers. "You taught me that this home is worth fighting for. You showed me that my own life was worth fighting for. We have come too far to surrender it all now. To surrender to men like that." A desperate, wild energy was coursing through her. She refused to be a victim. Her mind, always her greatest asset, began to race, sifting through the details of her lonely, observant trips to town. She saw things men like Jed and Vance, men of action and power, would never notice. The small patterns, the overlooked weaknesses. "Vance will be at the saloon," she said, thinking aloud. "He'll be there with his men, drinking, waiting for you to crawl to him. He'll be watching the street." Her eyes lit up. "But he won't be watching the back." She remembered the back of the saloon from her walks with Martha Simmons. The main office, where Vance conducted his business, had a barred window. Impenetrable. But next to it was the storeroom. She remembered seeing them unload barrels of whiskey, the wall of the storeroom just rough-hewn planks, not solid logs like the rest of the building. "Jed," she said, her voice urgent. "The storeroom, the wall is weak. We're not going to walk in the front door. We're going to make our own." The plan that formed was desperate, reckless, and their only chance. It was a plan born not of brute force, but of a woman's quiet observation. They wouldn't meet Vance's army head-on. They would be ghosts. They would use his arrogance against him, striking where he least expected it. Jed looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, the fierce intelligence shaping her face. He saw not the mail-order bride he had sent for, but a warrior queen. The despair in his own eyes began to recede, replaced by the faintest flicker of her own defiant hope. He had thought love was enough. He was beginning to realize that love, combined with courage, was a weapon all its own. Their first stop was the sheriff's office. Jed, leaning on Alara for support, his face a swollen testament to Vance's brutality, laid out the entire story for Sheriff Brody. The Whispering Springs. The abduction of Mateo. The ultimatum. Brody looked from Jed's battered face to Alara's steely resolve, and something in the old, weary lawman finally broke. He had spent years turning a blind eye, maintaining a fragile peace by appeasing the wolf at the town's door. But the wolf had now threatened to devour the town whole. This was no longer a property dispute. This was a kidnapping and a death threat. "He's gone too far," Brody growled, unlocking his gun cabinet and pulling out a gleaming shotgun. He looked at Jed. "By the authority vested in me by the Montana Territory, I'm deputizing you, Stone." He slid a tin star across the desk. "Let's go end this." As the town clock began its slow, heavy climb toward noon, the plan went into motion. The streets of Redemption Creek were unnaturally quiet. The townspeople shuddered in their homes, sensing the impending storm. At 10 minutes to noon, Sheriff Brody stepped into the middle of the street, shotgun held loosely at his side. "Silas Vance!" he bellowed, his voice echoing off the false front buildings. "I have a warrant for your arrest for the kidnapping and assault of Mateo Garcia. Come out with your hands high." As predicted, the batwing doors of the saloon flew open. Vance emerged, flanked by Lash and a half-dozen of his men, a look of amused disbelief on his face. "Brody, have you lost your mind?" Vance laughed. "You don't have the authority to arrest the man who owns you." This was the diversion. While Vance's attention was fixed on the lone lawman in the street, Jed and Alara were moving through the alley behind the saloon. Jed carried a heavy sledgehammer he'd taken from the blacksmith shop. The moment Brody yelled, Jed swung the hammer. The wood of the storeroom wall groaned, then splintered, then burst inward with a tremendous crash. They scrambled through the hole into the dark, whiskey-scented storeroom. Just as Alara had surmised, two of Vance's thugs were inside, playing cards on a barrel, guarding the door to the saloon's main room where Mateo was being held. They looked up, their faces slack with shock. Jed didn't hesitate. He brought the sledgehammer around in a low, brutal arc, catching the first man in the knees. The man screamed and went down. The second guard fumbled for his pistol, but Alara was already raising her Winchester. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. It missed the man, but it tore a chunk out of the wall next to his head, and he froze, his hands shooting into the air. Jed quickly relieved him of his weapon and bound both men with rope from a nearby crate. They untied a grateful, wide-eyed Mateo, pressing the captured pistol into his hand. Outside, the street had erupted into a full-blown gunfight. Brody was holding his own, using a horse trough for cover, but he was badly outnumbered. Just as Lash raised his pistol to take aim at the exposed sheriff, a shot rang out from an unexpected direction. A chip of wood flew from the post next to Lash's head. Everyone looked up. In the second-story window of the general store, Alara was braced, her Winchester aimed and ready. The battle became a three-front war. Brody in the street, Jed and Mateo bursting out of the saloon's side door, and Alara, their guardian angel, providing covering fire from above. Her shots were precise, calculated. She wasn't aiming to kill, but to control. She pinned down Vance's men, forcing them to keep their heads down, allowing Jed, Mateo, and the sheriff to gain ground. The townspeople, peeking from their windows, watched in awe as the quiet mail-order bride they had scorned fought with the calm ferocity of a seasoned veteran. The tide of the battle turned decisively. Vance's thugs, caught in a deadly crossfire and unnerved by the phantom shooter from above, began to fall or flee. Soon, only Lash and Vance remained, crouched behind an overturned wagon. Lash made a desperate run for it, but Mateo, moving with surprising speed, cut him off, a fierce joy on his face as he brought the butt of his pistol down hard on the man who had dragged him behind a horse. Now it was just two, Jedediah Stone and Silas Vance, facing each other in the silent, dusty street. The sound of their breathing seemed to fill the entire town. "You should have taken the money, Stone," Vance snarled, his charm stripped away to reveal the rabid animal beneath. "This is all your fault." "No," Jed said, his voice low and steady. "This is yours." They drew at the same time. The world seemed to slow down. Two shots cracked the air, almost as one. For a heart-stopping second, both men stood frozen. Then, a dark red stain blossomed on Vance's white shirt. A look of profound surprise crossed his face, and he crumpled to the ground, his reign of terror over. A thin line of red appeared on Jed's arm, Vance's final errant shot. A collective sigh seemed to pass through the town. The fight was over, but Alara's work wasn't done. While Jed and Brody secured the prisoners, she didn't join the celebration. She walked with purpose across the street and into the saloon. Using a key she took from Lash's unconscious form, she opened the door to Vance's office. It was exactly as she'd imagined, opulent, with a heavy oak desk. She began to search. In a locked bottom drawer she found it, a thick leather-bound ledger. She carried it out into the sunlight and handed it to Sheriff Brody. Inside he found what he'd always known but could never prove. Meticulous records of Vance's extortion, illegal land acquisitions, and payments to judges and officials across the territory. It was the key to dismantling Vance's entire corrupt empire. As she stood there, her rifle held loosely in her hand, she saw Beatrice Hemlock emerge from the bank, her face a mask of horrified disbelief. Her champion, the powerful man whose social standing had protected her, was dead. Her enemy, the worthless, barren woman, stood victorious, the town's savior. Alara met her gaze. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat. She simply looked at Beatrice with a quiet, unassailable dignity. In that silent, final confrontation, every cruel word Beatrice had ever spoken turned to ash in her mouth. She was exposed, her judgment revealed as nothing more than the bitter ramblings of a petty tyrant. Without a word, Beatrice turned and scurried back into the shadows of the bank, her power in Redemption Creek utterly and irrevocably broken. In the weeks that followed, a fragile peace settled over the valley. The fall of Silas Vance sent shockwaves through the territory, and with the evidence in his ledger, Sheriff Brody, revitalized with a new sense of purpose, began the long, slow work of cleaning house. At the Stone Ranch, life found a new, quieter rhythm. The work was still hard, but it was the work of building, not just surviving. Neighbors who had once shunned them now rode out to offer a day's labor, helping to mend the fences and repair the bullet-pocked walls of the cabin. Their offerings were a form of apology, a silent acknowledgement of their misplaced judgment. Jed and Alara accepted with grace. Mateo, his arm healed, worked with a new swagger. He was no longer just the ranch hand. He was a hero of the Battle of Redemption Creek, and he held a deep, abiding respect for both the man who had fought for him and the woman who had helped save him. The three of them had been forged into an unconventional, unshakable family. The town, too, began to heal. The whispers about Alara died, replaced by a quiet awe. They had all seen her in the window of the general store, a rifle in her hands, defending them all. She was no longer the barren bride from the east. She was Alara Stone, and her name was spoken with respect. The story ends one evening in late autumn. The air is crisp, smelling of wood smoke and fallen leaves. The day's work is done. Alara is sitting on the porch swing Jed built for her, a thick quilt wrapped around her shoulders. She is watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. Jed comes out of the cabin, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He hands one to her and sits beside her, the swing groaning softly under their combined weight. He slips his arm around her and she leans her head on his shoulder, the familiar solidness of him a constant comfort. Her free hand rests on her own stomach. The gesture is no longer one of sorrow or lack. It is just a hand resting on a body that is strong, whole, and hers. Her life was not empty. It was full to the brim with hard work, with friendship, with the fierce, quiet love of the man beside her. The future was unwritten, a vast, open territory just like the land before them. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. Jed squeezes her hand, his gaze on the last sliver of sun disappearing behind the jagged peaks of the bear's teeth. "It's a good life, Alara," he says softly. She looks out at the sprawling, beautiful, and dangerous land that is now her home. She thinks of the woman who stepped off the train, so full of fear and shame. She is a world away from that woman now. She has fought, she has bled, and she has loved. She has found her redemption. "Yeah," she whispers, the word carried away on the evening breeze. "It is enough."